Hello, everyone. So we are describing two applications. Both are built based on the same architecture and the same planning approach. And these applications do data analysis in different domains. The first application that we consider is a healthcare application. It's the early detection of complications in critical care. So the data source here on the left is an emergency room. There are a variety of devices in the emergency room that we can receive data from. This blue box in the middle, that's not very readable. It's just showing the variety of different data sources that you can receive. And there are some illustrations next to it that show what kinds of numbers or information we can receive from it. There's waveform data like ECGs. There's numeric data like heart rate, temperature, blood pressure, white blood cell count, and other information. And from this data, we can compute various indicators that can be used to assess the conditions of the patient and detect whether this patient is approaching a complication or not that the doctors need to react to. So there are some examples here that I'm not going to explain exactly what they mean, but they all have meaning for the doctors. SRS, for example, is a score from 0 to 4 that assesses how risky the state of the patient is currently based on a few parameters like the heart rate, the perspiration rate, and a couple of others. But this is not a complete list. So there was a study in 2003 that found that doctors in emergency rooms for every patient keep track of 200 variables. And for that reason, it's necessary to develop systems that help these doctors focus on the relevant parameters when necessary. And computations like that can help them, so there's need for IT systems that automatically decide which computations to perform and which indicators to compute. Another application that we're considering is a cybersecurity application. So we have a corporate network protected by a firewall, and there's a variety of information we can collect that would indicate malware infections or other problems in the network. And this information includes the information from the firewall itself, like the flows outside of the network, the alerts from the firewall that could detect some suspicious activity, as well as the internal communication with the servers on our internal network, with DHCP server, DNS server. We can even look at the network packets. So you see in the middle there are anomaly detectors. These are basically computations we can run on a scalable stream computing system to compute various indicators and detect potential problems in the network. So here again we have a list of some candidates that you can compute. You can detect port scans, accesses to malicious URLs, alerts from the firewall, and things like that. This is not a very complete list, and it's also important to note that these observations may come from different sources and may sometimes contradict each other. Could be missing. We could miss some sort of an attack happening in the network. So reasoning about these observations becomes challenging. We formulated the planning problem to address this reasoning issue. The planning problem at a high level generates plans which we call hypotheses that describe the possible state transitions of an entity, which means a host or a patient in different applications, given the history of observations. So we look at which observations happen and we infer the states, and then we use the inferred state to automatically deploy new analysis or inform the end users that the patient is in a critical state. Observations can be ambiguous, missing, or noisy, right? So we have, in addition to the partial observability, we have noisy observations. We also have temporally extended goals because the observations come over time, and the states can also change over time, and we need to meet the observations to satisfy the observations as they arrive by changing state. We also generate multiple optimal plans, and this is what we call top-K planning. The reason we need this is because for the same sequence of observations, we could have different explanations that are equally plausible or very closely equally plausible. And I will come back to how exactly that works. There's some practical considerations in building a system like this. There is a need to transform the input data to create the observations. There are knowledge engineering challenges, of course, in developing the planning domain. And we are also concerned with performance because this has to work on very large, for example, networks, analyzing data from a lot of machines. So just to start with an example, this is what the domain knowledge looks like in our system. We are capturing domain knowledge in the following form that seems to be easy to describe for doctors, for example, or to understand for doctors. What you see here is are states for the patient. They're color-coded. The green color means not so bad a state. The red color is a bad state. So the red colors here are the complications that can happen, like infarction or infection or DCI, which is a delayed cerebral ischemia. Which potentially can lead to death. And detecting those states requires observing different observations, and we, together with the domain knowledge, we receive the association between the observations that can appear in the states, and the states, right? So here we have some examples of the observations assigned to each state. Like I'm not going to go into the details of what these observations represent, but generally they can come from results of computation, analytics, from tests that are performed in a lab on a patient, and from interventions like drugs administered to the patient. We have record of that as well and can use that to reason. And given that information and a sequence of observations, we want to create hypotheses. So here we have 4 rows for 4 hypotheses. That's the output information of our planner. In each row you have 2 lines. The top line is the sequence of states. The bottom line is the sequence of observations. And the sequence of observations is the same. So these are 4 different explanations of the same sequence of observations that our system has generated. And because the observations can be noisy, you can see that sometimes there are observations like at the bottom that are not explained at all by any state, or there are some states that were transitioned through, but there were no observations of a patient being in that state. Now, how do we formalize this problem? We start by defining a hypothesis as a sequence of actions that satisfies a sequence of fluents, which represent the trace of observations. We define the relationship to planning by establishing a one-to-one relationship between hypothesis and plans, such that we can also compute plan costs that would represent plausibility of hypothesis. So that if we compute the lowest cost plans, that would give us the highest plausibility hypothesis. Now, to make this work in the system, we do it this way. So here we have the domain knowledge that we have seen before, right? That's on the top left. From there we go and represent that formally using a set of tools that we have developed. We have developed a language called LTS++ and the development environment that lets you enter descriptions of the model in that language, see it visualized graphically, and also test the model by giving it sample traces and looking at how it generates the hypothesis. Once this model is developed, it's used in the runtime system when we receive observation traces and order them by time of arrival of the observations. We can compile that observation trace together with the encoding of the model into a planning problem, a top K optimal planning problem, following the work by Sohrabi and others in AAAI 13. By solving that planning problem, we receive the plans that we can then translate into the generated hypothesis and use those hypotheses to get the state information for making decisions about which analytic actions to initiate, which additional analysis needs to be performed to provide better situational awareness for the doctor, for example, or the network administrator. The way this is implemented is shown here. So in addition to the automated hypothesis exploration that we've discussed, that's shown at the top, we also have layers at the bottom that support the execution of analytics. The analytics management layer that takes the request to deploy an analytic and translates it into an executable code. And analytic platforms that execute this code, this could be Hadoop or stream processing systems or other systems that you have that can process data received from the data sources that you have. This is supported by a knowledge infrastructure for keeping hypothesis models, knowledge about the analytics that are available, and observation streams, and tools for knowledge engineering and presenting the results, interacting with the end user. When you want to implement the system on a different domain, there are two major challenges that we found. One is the need to transform the raw data, like waveform data, into observations. So here, this is an example of heart rate variability measurement. There could be low variability, which is an indicator of a dangerous condition. That type of analysis can be difficult and time-consuming. You have to really understand the data to make sure you understand what is low variability versus high variability. And that's a challenge that needs to be addressed in every domain. Knowledge engineering is another challenge, so knowledge models need to be captured from experts in new domains. We developed a tool that makes it easy for IT administrators, or not administrators, IT personnel that works with the doctors, for example, with the experts to capture the models. And we also provide them with a 9-step process for model design as described in the paper, how to elicit this knowledge. So how does this work in practice? We were worried about the performance, so we measured, for example, accuracy in a very large application. So we have 2 million hosts in a network. 40,000 of those hosts are inside our corporate network. The rest are outside the machines that they're communicating with on the internet. The raw input data for this type of analysis was 75,000 messages per second. We got good results in terms of accuracy. For more than half of the machines that were infected, we were able to detect that early. Of course, this is due both to the analytics that we had and the reasoning that we have done over the results of those analytics to deploy additional analysis. But still, it's a pretty good result, 1 hour ahead warning for this type of infection. The workload is pretty dynamic, so you can see in the middle there are changes with time of how many hosts are communicating. And under that varying workload, we have pretty good response time showing in the last plot. This includes the planning time to generate hypotheses as well as time to deploy analytics. That takes 3 seconds on average in this application. So there is some related work in this area, and primarily this kind of applications of planning have been studied in several related flavors. The first one is a plan recognition paper by Ramirez and Geffner that uses planning for plan recognition. The work by Sohrabi and others in KR provided the compilation of explanations into planning problems. The work by Bauer and others looked at diagnosis problems and compiled them into planning problems. And what we're using in this paper directly is the last paper on that list by Sohrabi, Udrea, and myself. There are other related work that relates to the analytics. So some of the performance results that we saw were due to the analytics that we were using. And these analytics are described in the various surveys. In healthcare, for example, there is a large body of work on clinical decision support systems. There is a lot of similarity in what we're doing to what has been done in those systems, although we are the first to take this knowledge-based approach to managing the analysis. So to summarize the contributions of this work, we have developed a system architecture that can be used across domains for large-scale analysis automation. It can reason about unreliable observations, and it uses planning to do that. To make the system work, you need to develop data transformations that receive observations from raw data, and we've developed those kind of transformations for 2 domains. We also developed a description language for models and the development environment to capture domain knowledge. And we've done evaluation in 2 domains showing that it scales, and we received pretty positive feedback from the doctors that we've talked to in the healthcare application. So both of these applications that I talked to are research prototypes at this stage. They're sufficiently advanced. We interact with customers when we work on them, and we started incorporating initial feedback. Thank you.